Welcome to a panel that I'm co-moderating together with Trey, Yingst, who's the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent from Fox News Channel. So we're doing a double act here of co-moderation, a bit like a morning television show. And the topic for the discussion today, or now, is Russia winning or is it collapsing? Which is a question that you get very contradictory answers to if you ask people in the West right now, particularly if you look at different television channels, because you get very different messages. There are some people who see that Russia is essentially making advances on the Eastern Front, and its economy has been more resilient than many had expected, and Vladimir Putin, of course, is still in power, and in many ways is consolidating power. There are others who point out that actually, given how much the Russian government has thrown into the fight, their advance has been extremely limited, and that the Russian economy is showing many signs of pressure and problems, not least because it's starting to see some of the banks implode. Since I write for the Financial Times, we track the financial system very closely and see that as a good bellwether of what is actually happening. And there's another meme which has gone around a lot of Western military circles recently, pointing out that if a snail had started in Rostov at the same time as the Russian invasion, it would now be in central Poland, and the Russians, of course, have only managed to advance a tiny bit in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Ukraine in that time by comparison. So very mixed pictures of what is or is not happening right now in Russia. But we have an amazing panel to discuss this. On my immediate left, on your right is Happymon Jacob, who's the editor of India's World magazine. Next to him is Sergiy Kyslytsya, who's the first Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Next to him is Niall Ferguson, who's at the Hoover Institute in Stanford. And at the end is Jade McGlynn, who's the head of the Ukraine and Russia program in King's College, and also partly based in Kyiv. So perhaps I'm going to ask the first question, then toss to Trey, and I'm going to ask it to the first Deputy Minister, and ask from the Ukrainian perspective, looking at the military situation, looking at how Russia is trying to reposition itself in the world in relation to other countries, do you think Russia right now is winning or collapsing?
Well, thank you. I would rather use present perfect tense because I want to say that Russia has already lost. It's not that Russia did lose, it has lost. Does any one of you know what Haitian way is? Andres? Exactly. Thank you. And let me quote, "To strengthen national sovereignty, to ensure the healthy development of geographic information, and to implement Chinese law." A year after the full-scale invasion was launched, the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources adopted a decision that a vast territory, a huge number of what is today Russia, should be called Chinese names. Interestingly, after the Russian government received that information, they quietly swallowed it, and they kept quiet. In May the same year, Poland's Commission on Standardization of Geographical Names recommended to use the name Królewec for Kaliningrad. And Putin's spokesperson said, "It's a pure case of Russophobia and a process bordering on madness." That example shows you how much Russia is subservient with respect to China, how much Putin is obedient with respect to Xi Jinping. And it also reminds me of what happened to Russia in the 13th century until the 17th century, when Russia was paying tribute first to the Golden Horde and then to Crimean Khanate. So if we look about where Russia is today geopolitically, we pay attention to what is the relationship right now with China.
So in that respect, Russia may seem to be winning within its own backyard, but on the geopolitical stage is only strong by virtue of essentially being the younger brother or the subservient partner to China.
Well, absolutely. And I think that one of the points that our American friends make these days, and it's public information, it's not nothing secret about it, that in order to stop this war, we have to cut off the supply of money and material resources and other things. So if we look at who are the major suppliers of money and other things that are necessary to continue this war, the geography is very clear.
We know this war is a war that is multifaceted. And so Ukraine, as we speak, is under attack again from either drones or missiles or a combination of the two. There's also a front line. And Happymon, I want to ask you about that front line that is hundreds of kilometers long. When you look at the situation on the ground, help us understand what victory would look like for Ukraine and for stability in Eastern Europe.
Thank you, Trey, for that question. I must confess that I come from India. I don't live here, so my knowledge of the region is what I see in newspapers and watch online. So I'm going to sort of stick to somewhat of a conceptual response to that answer. Do I see Russia collapsing? No, I don't see Russia collapsing. I mean, I'm being as honest and as provocative as I can, but I don't think Russia is collapsing. I will focus, therefore, on the military victory or defeat part of it. I think it is important to define what victory is and what defeat is. Let's look at some of the material aspects of it. I think it is a mixed bag. The Russian war aims that it had in the beginning when it went into war have not been met. It has suffered spectacular losses in terms of men and material. There's no doubt about that. And yet, I would say, at the end of the day, for Russia, an absence of military victory doesn't amount to its military defeat. What do I mean by that? To defeat Russia, it will need to be removed forcibly from the occupied territories that it has today in Ukraine. Put differently, Ukraine's lack of victory, its inability to push back Russia to the original lines is Russia's victory in some ways. What about, you might ask, what about the fallen Russian soldiers? Hundreds of thousands of them have been killed. I don't know if Russia would look at the fallen soldiers, hundreds of thousands of killed soldiers, and say, hey, that is a defeat for us. Different people, different countries look at these things very differently. What about the war aims? Every country goes into a war with expansive and maximalist aims as far as war aims are concerned. They have not been fulfilled, they have not been met. Yes, that's true. But I don't think we should judge on the basis of the expansive war aims whether Russia has won or lost. It's rebuilding its military, its defense production has increased. What about Putin's ability to sell his victory or loss domestically? I think today, with Donald Trump doing what he is doing, I think Putin is in a much better position to sell this as a victory at home. I'll come to one more point and then I can come back.
Of course, and I wanted to follow up, though, how important is it for the Ukrainians to define victory so their allies in Europe and the United States are able to assist with that mission?
I think it is very important to have a clear definition of what you mean by victory for Ukraine. If you don't have that clarity on what is that you want out of this war in terms of clarity, I think it's going to be a problematic choice for the United States of America, for the European partners, because there is also a geopolitical aspect to the victory and defeat at this point of time. Last year, when I was here, and I said Russia is perhaps losing, in many ways, geopolitically speaking, it was isolated, it was sanctioned, it was friendless, it was weakened. Can we say that about Russia today? The Donald Trump administration has single-handedly changed the balance of power equations in the international system. It has brought Russia back into the great power conversations. It has brought Russia back into summit meetings. So today, Russia is not the Russia of 2024. And therefore, to say that Russia is isolated and geopolitically weakened, it's good to make that argument. I don't think that is accurate. What about the Europeans? Are they united in their fight against Russia? What about the United States? Has it resolved that it is going to defeat Putin's aggression in Ukraine? I don't think this have happened either. I'll end with one final point, and that is about the success of the. I could be wrong, but my sense is that the success of Russian nuclear deterrence, as it were. It has managed to deter the Europeans and the Americans from directly supplying armaments to Ukraine and directly supporting Ukraine beyond a point. That, in some ways, is Russia's success. And I'm saying all of this in all honesty, because I think it is important to be clear about the basics when we fight a war. Thank you. Back to you.
Well, I think that's one reason why it's so powerful to get the voice from the global south. And so essentially what we have is Deputy Minister Kyslytsya essentially saying that Russia has won because it's basically become a vassal state. Russia's lost because it's become a vassal state of China, essentially.
Absolutely. And I would like to say, following what we just heard, Russia is much weaker today than it used to be even last year. We just came from Paris, where we had a coalition of willings, and President Macron reminded us that when they met in February last year, there were only 2 countries willing to deploy troops in Ukraine, and now there are more than 26 countries that are willing to contribute to the coalition of willings in terms of deploying flags and boots in Ukraine. So I think that in spite of all the hype in the media, Europe is more united today than Europe was even a year ago.
Right. Well, so that's the more optimistic side. I think Happymon has presented a perspective which is more about looking at the fact that Russia has not collapsed, and there's actually reasons to see that it's not lost. Niall, well, unless do you want to follow?
Just a couple of things.
And then I'm going to toss
Russia has never had a chance to live in the state of prosperity or relative wealth. 25% of Russian households have never had running water. So what you think and how you defined economic collapse in the West is not the same thing as in the Russian Federation. So you don't expect Russians to complain that their living standards went down so dramatically that they would move on Kremlin and remove the dictator in Kremlin.
Right. Well, that seems a good moment to bring in Niall, because I know that Niall, in your Green Mantle consultancy group, have been doing a lot of research recently looking at the state of the Russian economy and whether or not it actually is winning or losing. And of course, you put that within a very long historical context of having studied wars, military history, and financial history over centuries. So what is your evaluation of that?
Thanks, Gillian. I think it's extremely important to stare some realities in the face in this conversation. At the beginning of this war, we were told that economic sanctions would bring Russia's economy to its knees. I remember the Wall Street Journal promising 8 on the Richter scale of sanctions. I never believed that. And it's turned out to be quite wrong. We also need to recognize that the United States is no longer assisting Ukraine. And I encounter people at this conference who don't appear to have grasped that reality. Deliveries, financial aid have ceased. Anything that comes from the United States from this point on will have to be paid for. That means that this war is now Europe's war. And that pits Europe against not only Russia, but also China. And this is where I must disagree with you, with all due respect. Russia is not losing the war in Ukraine if it has the backing of China, because China is by far the largest manufacturing power in the world. It has double the manufacturing value added of the United States and dwarfs that of Europe. Even without China, here's a fact that I learned from Moritz Schulerich's excellent Kiel Institute. Russian military spending is almost the same as that of EU and UK measured in purchasing power parity terms. These facts should sober us all of us who wish for a Ukrainian victory. Let me go on. Far from having its economy crippled by sanctions, Russia has had its economy stimulated by war to an extent that is almost a textbook example of how a war economy works. Let me give you some more bold facts. Since the fourth quarter of 2022, Russia's output of Lancet drones has risen by 260%. The same applies to its production of tanks. Its short-range air defense systems output has risen at 233%. For infantry fighting vehicles, it's up 180%. For artillery, up 180%. And that was from a base of stocks far higher than that, not just of Ukraine, but of Europe. Moreover, Europe's intended additional procurement, since the great and much vaunted announcements of rearmament earlier this year, are a rounding error in quantitative terms compared with this scale of increased production. Now, Gillian, you mentioned the faint hope that I encounter regularly that Russia's economy will oblige us by entering a crisis. This is wishful non-thinking. You can find evidence of overheating and distress in the kind of sectors that you'd expect to find distressed in a war economy. Residential real estate, for example. There has been an increase in non-performing loans. But anybody who thinks this is going to translate into an economic crisis is smoking some very strong substance. Let me just give you some more facts, sobering though they are. So Russian military spending has roughly doubled in the course of the war. It's north of 7% of GDP. Its deficit currently, or last year, stood at 2.4% of GDP, 2.5 rather. Its debt to GDP is a mere 14%. This puts it in a fiscally stronger position than I think just about every EU member state. A third of the state's revenues are from oil and gas, which it continues to sell on global markets through its shadow fleet, despite all talk of sanctions. The inflation rate is 8.7%. But get this, Russian real wages have risen 22% since the war began. Unemployment simply doesn't exist. Disposable income is up 48%. Retail sales are 28% up. Consumer sentiment in Russia today is at all-time highs. The sanctions regime has failed utterly, partly because no one was serious on either side of the Atlantic about cutting off revenues to Russia from its exports of fossil fuels, but also because of a massive hypocrisy by European states that have continued to export to Russia via third countries. I can assure you, Europe's trade with Kyrgyzstan did not quadruple because Kyrgyzstan is going through an economic boom. So we need to live in the real world, a real world in which Russia has in fact proved quite successful, as we heard this morning at breakfast, for example, it's scaling up drone production in a way that Europe is not able to match. And now that this project of supporting Ukraine is essentially a EU project, the most urgent thing that we need to discuss is how can Europe possibly match the current scale of armaments production on the other side? Because if it fails to compensate for the fact that the US is no longer a source of aid to Ukraine, then I'm afraid ultimately it's very hard for me as a historian to see another outcome of this conflict than yet another case where Russia, wasting the lives of Russian men and boys on a scale that is stunning to behold, nevertheless grinds out a victory. That is the nightmare scenario that we need to stare in the face on the basis of simple economics. That is currently the higher probability scenario, much higher probability scenario than Russian collapse.
Jade, I want to bring you in here to talk about Russian conceptions of Ukraine and following Mr. Ferguson's comments about what this means for the future of the conflict, their posture in the region right now, and their belief of what victory looks like on the Russian side.
Thank you. This goes back earlier, actually, to Jacob's comment too around needing to have a clear definition of what victory means for Ukraine. And I've always liked General, now Ambassador Zaluzhny's definition, which is when we've done enough so that the Russians don't try to come back again. And I think that if we use that as the measure, then we have to say that nowhere near enough is being done to stop what is driving this war from the Russian conceptualization. And ultimately, that is not economic opportunity. And whilst the economy will always be a constraint, of course, on Russia's ability to enact what it wants to achieve, it won't be the deciding factor until we get to a point of total collapse, which we're very far away from. This war, from the Russian perspective, is about subjugating Ukraine as part of its step in its rather institutionalized efforts to manifest its collective narcissism, the sense that Russia is an inherently great power that has a right to a say, to a rather dictatorial say, over the European security architecture. And so in some ways, I guess the question comes back to Europe. The question is not how is Ukraine defining victory, but rather Europe, what do we want in Europe? I mean, what is Britain? What is France? What do we want? How do we want this war to end? Do we want Ukraine to win? Do we want Russia to collapse? Is there somewhere in between? And if once we've decided what we want, then I think we can also talk about to what extent that's realistic or even achievable. But I'm pretty certain that in most European countries, even the most pro-Ukrainian, we still haven't really come to terms with the question of what we actually want.
Neil, if you could follow up, you recently said in an interview that Putin could exploit a prolonged campaign in Ukraine and wait for global support of Ukraine to erode. Talk about the risks and the sense of urgency that Europe needs to feel at this moment.
Well, it's easy to see why Putin is in no rush to stop the war, not only for the reasons that I've given, but because he has already seen appreciable splits in the Western world. The United States, with the election of President Trump, was clearly bound to embark on a different course, and we are, in effect, in the damage limitation phase from a European perspective of that change. Moreover, President Putin can look at the electoral politics in three major European states. I use the term European broadly: the UK, France, and Germany. And what he sees there is that populist parties are far ahead of the governing party in both Britain and France, and neck with it in Germany. So the political trends are also encouraging from his vantage point. The fiscal trends are encouraging too. Just about all the European economies of consequence, with the exception of Germany, have a major debt problem, and that debt problem is being compounded by rising long-term interest rates, so that the majority of members of the G7, for example, are now in violation of Ferguson's law. Ferguson's law states that if you are spending more on interest payments than on defense, then you will be in trouble quite soon with your foreign policy. So from Putin's point of view, the trends are mostly his friend. Ukraine is reliant on the support of democracies, and democracies are fickle. Putin is reliant on the support of autocracies, and we see reaffirmed, most recently with the meetings in China, how strongly supportive Xi Jinping is of Putin, who can also count on support from North Korea, not to mention a much weakened Iran. The critical point that I want to convey in this discussion is that Europe ought to be able to compensate for the change of US policy because it has potentially vast resources available. If you look at the scale of the COVID relief programs that the EU passed, they're vastly in excess of what has been given to Ukraine in the form of aid thus far. It's absurd. It's insane that Europe's defense spending is equivalent to Russia's on a PPP basis, considering how vastly larger the EU economy is. What has happened in the past year is in some ways good and in some ways dreadful. The good thing is, not least under the pressure of President Trump, the Europeans committed to increasing substantially their defense budgets. And in the case of Germany, this is a very big deal, which required a change to the constitution to remove the debt brake and a major increase in spending on defense as well as on infrastructure. Great, brilliant, long overdue. I went to Berlin last July and strongly argued for this before Friedrich Merz became chancellor. The bad news is that these increased resources are not being translated into the kind of hardware that is urgently needed right now for Ukraine. How are Ukraine's air defenses doing under what has been the most sustained aerial bombardment of the war so far? They're doing okay, but that's the most that can be said. And it's not surprising because they're clearly insufficient for the task. Is Europe working night and day to produce comparable air defenses to those that were available from the US? No. Is there any serious effort to scale drone production in the way that the Russians are doing? No, we heard this morning that Ukraine leads in technological innovation and can mass produce drones itself, but it can't afford to buy all the drones that it can make. There's a huge delta, in other words, between the resources that have been willed by European governments and what is actually being translated into hardware that Ukraine can use today. What we need, what we must all argue for in the major European capitals is the equivalent of Operation Warp Speed for European rearmament.
Absolutely.
And my arguments for this, very briefly, are threefold. Number one, you cannot afford to allow Ukraine to lose this war. It represents a disastrous threat to the security of the whole of Europe at a time when the transatlantic alliance can no longer be taken for granted. Two, there will be meaningful economic benefits for the stagnant economies of Europe, and in particular Germany, if you do Operation Warp Speed rearmament. And the third reason is that nothing is more likely to head off the populist challenge than economic success by centrist governments. These are not just existential issues for Ukraine, they are existential for Europe itself.
Right. Well, thank you, Neil. I can see that Anders has been dying to jump in here. I don't know whether you're speaking with your Swedish identity or the fact you're a professor in Georgetown, but yes, give us some thoughts. We have a microphone just over here.
Thank you. Always exciting to hear Niall, so let me respond to all your points. First, I have stopped using purchasing power parity since CIA in the 1980s said that West Germany was poorer than East Germany, and they were almost as bad on the Soviet Union. Purchasing power parity are very treacherous. You can come up with any results. So I don't use them. I think instead we should look upon the real military expenditures in dollars. In Russia, they're about $150 billion a year. Ukraine, $100 or $120 billion, depending on what value you put on the Western arms. The Russian military organization is highly centralized and massively corrupt. The same with the arms industry. I would not take them seriously, apart from when it comes to scaling up, that they are very good at. And Ukraine is far better. And as you elegantly said, the only problem Ukraine is money. Money is a much easier problem. And as you and I have both argued before, $200 billion is sitting in Belgium and should be taken. And this should really be the conclusion of it. And how I look upon the situation is that the financial sanctions do very well. Russia is now, during the second half of this year, running out of its National Welfare Fund. It needs about $40 billion a year, or has used to for the last 3 years, to finance a budget deficit of 2% of GDP. Russia's growth, and now that money is finished, and Russia has had a growth rate since 2009 of an average of just over 1%. It was slightly more in the last 2 years because they pumped up these old Soviet arms producers east of the Urals. This is not a modern economy. It's a backward economy, while the western part of the country is suffering badly. And how should we look upon the situation? Well, I would argue that the oil revenues, or the total export revenues, have fallen by 1/3 since 2022 and are staying low because of the Western sanctions. So the oil and gas sanctions work pretty well. and the financial sanctions work excellently. So Russia is starved of funding, and now they need to cut. The federal expenditures is about 20% of GDP to 17% of GDP because they have no source of financing. Their wonderful partners, China, are not providing any financing at all. And to conclude, I think that this looks most of all like Germany 1918. The German troops stood far beyond the German borders, both in the east and the west. But Germany had a revolution in Berlin because of their poor economic situation. That's what I think of and hope for Russia.
Can I respond to that very briefly?
I just want to get to Nataliya, and then we'll come back to the panel.
I think that also Nataliya was also going to come in and comment about what's happening inside Russia. And of course, the question we all want to know is whether there really is any sign of a split around Putin.
And if I could just add to that, if you could talk about an interview you did last year with Hudson Institution, talking about Ukraine's strategic clarity and what example Ukraine can set for Europe in terms of their ability to produce and promote domestic production of defense goods to defend their country.
Thank you. I'll start by actually challenging.
And we should quickly say that you're Nataliya Bugayova, who is a non-resident Russia fellow at the Institute for the Study of War.
Thank you, Gillian. I'll start by actually challenging the framing of the question. I think it's this kind of debate at extremes of Russia being too weak or too strong that prevented exploitation of more nuanced vulnerabilities. So I think we should restore clarity on 4 points. One, Russia is not weak per se. It's not about to collapse, but Russia is weak relative to its objectives. Russia invaded Ukraine with insufficient resources to achieve its goals. Putin has failed to achieve any of his stated military objectives despite taking 1 million casualties. So the gap between goals and means still exists. I think point number 2 is that the policy, the Western policy of incrementalism, is what helped Russia close the gap partially between the goals and means, because it allowed Putin and give him time and space to adapt on the battlefield, to mobilize defense industrial base, and also secure resources from partners like China and North Korea. This policy of incrementalism also, however, masked weaknesses and vulnerabilities that I really wanted to highlight. And this is point number 3, that Russia does have weaknesses and vulnerabilities. For example, Russia is a lot more dependent on will and capability of others than most people think. They are dependent on support from China and North Korea. They depend on Belarus for basing. They depend on shadow fleets that they don't own. Above all, they also depend on Western acceptance of a lot of Russian fake premises. For example, that it just simply deserves to have the territory that it doesn't control, and like in Donetsk, that would take years for Russia to take by force. So we can take a lot of that away if we choose to and bring down Russia to the true size of its capability and then see how well it does. I think the final point on vulnerabilities, Russia is accumulating quite a bit of risk internally, economically, but also societal risk. Rising ultranationalism is clashing with Putin's more usual model of ruling through imperialism. That is a structural clash. Russia may seem stable, but it's fragile. Western incrementalism also increases Russia's ability to absorb risk because it gives Putin time to normalize new and worse realities. So I think the final point is, to answer the question whether Russia is winning or collapsing, it will depend on whether the West will abandon its policy of incrementalism, abandon a strategy of impaling ourselves on one game-changing capability that simply does not exist in this war, and actually make Russia face something it hasn't in this war, which is momentum and sustained pressure, which is extremely vulnerable to.
Thank you very much. Minister Kyslytsya, if you could respond to those comments, and in the context of the conflict, how does Ukraine exploit those Russian weaknesses, given the fact that they often are on their own and the support from Europe can take a long time to arrive? And so they can identify these weaknesses. How can Ukraine exploit them to their advantage?
Right. Well, first of all, I would like to say that the premise victory is not the best way to build this discussion on, because in the case of these conflicts, it's not about victory. It's not about getting a trophy and put it on your shelf and be proud that you won. It's about how to reach the point of resolution and kind of settlement that will be to the satisfaction of Ukrainians and Europeans. During my years in New York, when I would be asked that question, I would revert immediately and I would say to visiting Europeans, what would be the solution that the French or the British or the Germans would accept? Because it's not about just Ukraine, it's about how we see Europe in many decades to come. Because no matter what the solution is, Russia will continue to be an imminent threat for all of us. Because even if there is a change of regime in Russia, we can't really have an overnight democratization of the country, because in order to have democratic elections, we would need to have the whole spectrum of political parties, free media, everything. And it would take ages for us to develop. Then, with respect to the statistics that have been used in this discussion, I mean, in terms of Russia, it's very, very, very wrong to use the statistics that are coming out of Russia, because the overwhelming majority of the necessary parameters for the quality analysis are being classified. You can't have an analysis of what's going on in the banking sector of Russia because half of the statistics is classified. The same is about the energy. You know, budget deficit in the last 7 months has already reached 59 billion euros, which is already a record thing compared to the last year. It's 4.5 times more than the budget deficit last year. So I do not agree that the Russian economy is on the rise. I think that the type of the economy that Russia has developed is not sustainable. And it doesn't suit the peaceful time. Because I can't really see how the Russian economy can run next day after the peaceful settlement. And I think that Putin does realize it. And that is why he procrastinates. That is why he does everything possible, because his survivability depends on the kind of economy he, unfortunately for the Russians, has developed. Thank you.
Jade, I'm curious, do you see any sign, or any of the others, I know you're watching Russia closely, do you see any sign of schisms or splits around the president, Putin?
I definitely see the splits that Nataliya is talking about in terms of the ethno-nationalist or Z-blogger divide. But first of all, I wanted to come more broadly to Nataliya's points and also to very strongly recommend her primer on Russian cognitive warfare, which is the only sensible thing I've read on the topic in the English language, to be perfectly honest. But I suppose it takes me back to the original point of, but what does Europe want to achieve? Because if we think about the former Ukrainian foreign minister, Volodymyr Azhirko, he once claimed, or once said, I think quite rightly, that the West doesn't understand Russia, but what's worse is until recently it didn't want to, because who knows what to do with such a Russia? And I think that's the biggest issue that comes up. I think it's not that there aren't plenty of wise people like Nataliya and many, many others, and indeed innumerable Ukrainians explaining, what this war is about for Russia. The Russians themselves say these things. We want to reorder the European security architecture. The problem is that most people in Europe do not want to hear this, because that's politically very unappealing to have to explain to your voters. It's very expensive. And so everybody continues to pretend that there's an option whereby, Ukraine gets to survive, Europe gets to live in peace, and Russia somehow remains stable. And I'm afraid there isn't. There is no solution that doesn't require somebody losing. And there is no solution that doesn't require there is no good solution that doesn't require European countries putting some skin in the game.
Mr. Ferguson, would you like to respond?
So there's a really important debate that we're having here. And I don't want to give the impression that I think Russia is strong and doesn't have the weaknesses that Anders and Nataliya alluded to. They're the classic weaknesses of a war economy that you would see in any economy that had more than doubled its defense expenditure and was in a war that was into its fourth year. The mistake is to think that these weaknesses are signs of collapse, which is the word in the title of this session. And that I find extremely hard to envision. And as you mentioned, 1918. But the German collapse in 1918, which I have studied at great length, was the consequence of American intervention and a massive British offensive, which was superior technologically to anything the Germans had, including the use of tanks. This is quite a different situation from the situation that we face today when the United States has ceased to support Ukraine, and when the Ukrainian army is the one that is very thinly stretched. We can't escape the reality that however good Ukrainian drones are, there is a manpower problem. And it's a manpower problem for political reasons. But a war of attrition is not going to be won by a middle-aged army that has no youthful reserves to draw on. It's fine to talk about Russian weaknesses, but not if it's cope. Not if it's cope. What about the European weaknesses that seem to me very germane to this discussion, since now you are reliant on Europe? Well, one of the most interesting things is just to look at research and development in defense. Did you know that US research and development on defense is an order of magnitude larger than European research and development, which is why Europe does not have the sophisticated weapon systems that this war requires. This war is not going to be won by building more and more howitzers and the ammunition for them. This war is about a new frontier technologically in which a critical role is played by defenses against aerial attack. And that is where Europe is not well placed to take over the role that the United States has been playing. And finally, if you want to sober yourself up on this issue, look at the most recent report on European rearmament from the Kiel Institute. One thing that leaps out is the fact that Europe enters this new phase of the war having drastically depleted its own stocks of military hardware across almost every domain. I guess it's appropriate that we carried on having this discussion during an air alert because it illustrates the point I've just made about aerial defenses. If you look at the situation, let me make one final point, of the Middle East, which we don't talk nearly enough about, despite the fact that it plays a very similar part in the global geopolitical calculus. The reason Iran is on its knees is Israel's technological superiority relative to Russian-designed air defenses. Until you have that kind of invincibility, the ability to penetrate the enemy's air defenses and to have secure defenses of your own territory, you're not close to Israel. And Ukraine has to be close to Israel in its capability because it's not going to get into NATO, no matter how many times we make speeches about that subject at this event. The transition to being capable of being Israel requires not only your own technological ingenuity, but substantial outside support. Israel gets that from the United States, and it has done since its very inception. You now rely on European assistance. And if you look closely at Europe's capabilities, they are so far from being a sufficient replacement for the United States that that is the real crisis we face. It's not what Ukraine does. Ukraine's doing an awesome job of holding the line. But unless Europe does Operation Warp Speed rearmament, which it is currently not doing, then all the technological ingenuity and courage that this great nation has mustered will not suffice.
Happymon, I want to bring you in here. You have called the Ukraine war the grand chessboard of geopolitics. And in our last 15 minutes here, I want to shift the discussion to the future, the near future. What do you see as the next steps, the next move for Europe in this war?
You know, let's talk about the near future or the distant future. A lot of conversation about how the Russian economy is declining, it's weakening. If you want to take pleasure in the argument that the Russian economy will weaken in the years to come, go for it. That doesn't win you the war in Ukraine, unfortunately. If you want to take pleasure in the argument that at some point of time, the Russians will come under the influence of the Chinese in the region, go for it. But that doesn't win you the war in Ukraine, unfortunately. Let me also put it this way. Unfortunately, thanks to Gaza, thanks to what Israel has done in Gaza, Europe has unfortunately lost the moral argument. So you don't have the moral argument, the moral power, and nor are you investing enough in winning this war, materially speaking, militarily speaking, in Ukraine. So from a global south point of view, you come across as wanting on both sides, on the moral argument question and on the military argument question. Let me put it this way. You asked about the longer run implications, the geopolitics of it. If you don't win this war, be prepared to make peace with balance of power, be prepared to make peace with spheres of influence, be prepared to make peace with great power competition, contestation in your neighborhood. That world is going to come back. There's no getting away from that reality. I think I just want to sort of leave one final comment for your consideration, that you can't fight half-hearted wars. We back in South Asia, we fought enough wars. We fought with the Chinese, we fought with the Pakistanis. You can't fight half-hearted wars. It appears that you're fighting, except the Ukrainians, of course, you're fighting somebody else's war. Of course you're fighting somebody else's war. So you are either in or you're not in it. This war will not take you anywhere.
Yeah, I can see that Deputy Minister Kyslytsya wants to come in. I can see from his face he's got some things he wants to say.
Right. I don't want to use the narratives and paradigms of the 19th and the 20th century to deal with the security issues in Ukraine. We are living in the 21st century. Europe is bound to live with Russia next to it for the next 30 to 50 years as the major source of the threat. And Europe is bound to develop the deterrence policies that will allow Europe to be safe in the meantime. Yes, I do agree with those, although I don't want to join the band of the Europe bashers. I do agree with those who believe that Europeans developed a kind of hedonistic society where social cohesion and social solidarity surpassed the needs of security. But I'm looking at Europe in a more positive way. I'm looking at Europe that is rich and capable and smart enough to reinvent itself. And I think that if those trends that we see in the last 3 years deeply root into the society, into the politics, Europe is bound to be strong and safe and able to deter the threat that will be imminent for the time being in the next half a century. So I don't see really this doomsday scenario. And I don't believe that Russia as is capable to win the arms race, if there is one, if there is a real arms race. All right?
Maybe it's a good moment to pull in some voices from the audience and see if anyone else wants to ask a question or a comment. Please keep it extremely short because time is very limited, and briefly identify yourself. Yes, very briefly. I'd say literally think about 1 or 2 sentences, max.
Yes, it's a great discussion. And I would like to ask, you see the synchronization of the authoritarian regimes, and you see the lack of synchronization on our side of the democracies. How you see the methodology to become our side, democratic side, more synchronized after that we have not so firm in transatlantic ties? Thank you.
So how do we get the...
My name is Emmanuel Zingeris, Foreign Affairs Committee, Parliament of Lithuania. Thank you.
Right. Jade, do you want to jump in there? Do you see any world where the democracies become more synchronized, or Niall?
Unfortunately, the lesson of history is that democracies tend to achieve this kind of coordination only in the wake of disaster. That is the stark reality. If you look at the current attitude, and we were discussing this earlier, of people in London, of people in Paris, of people in Berlin, they simply do not see that what happens here, including air raids like the one we were just warned about, could happen to them. There is a complete disconnect in terms of the imaginations of the public of Western Europe. And it gets bigger the further away you get.
Right. I can see
Kyiv.
both. Yeah, Jade and Happymon both want to comment. Yeah.
I just very quickly wanted to come in to second that point and to say, I mean, it's just such a huge psychological disconnect. I recently moved from the UK to Tallinn because I couldn't cope with coming back from Kharkiv in the east to going back to London and these policy discussions that just seemed entirely divorced from reality. And that's in a country that is very pro-Ukraine, Britain. And then the other point to make, especially since the person who reminded me of this phrase recently entered the room, is I don't think it's about Europe bashing. I don't think that's what anybody here is necessarily trying to do. I think it's about the Gramscian phrase of the pessimism of the intellect. So we need to have good situational awareness if we want to act properly, and optimism of the will. That doesn't mean you don't try to continue to do positive things, but we have to be honest about what we are seeing, and it's pessimistic.
You know, democracy as an idea doesn't win you wars. Military power does, unfortunately. Not all democracies are your friends. Not all non-democracies are your enemies. I mean, we are fighting a war with China. We are next door to China. Our problem with China is not democracy. Our problem with China is that China is asking for our territory. It has captured our territory. That's our problem. I think it is important to see through some of these arguments. I mean, I agree with you. I sort of respect your point, but I don't necessarily think that is the way to divide the world. Either you are with democracies or you're with non-democracies. The world doesn't function that way, unfortunately.
Right. I'll just say from my point of view, as someone who sits in a university in England, I spend a lot of time trying to tell the students to wake up and smell the coffee. And the East European students get it immediately. British students don't. And when I recently went on the BBC on Newsnight and said something along those lines, I got trolled big time. There is, as you've heard, a big cognitive gap. I think there was another question behind there, the lady back there.
Thank you, Hannah Shalist, Ukrainian Prism. Happymon, I have a question to you, or to look beyond Europe. Do you feel that the last year we see the Russian information operations that they are winning more directing to the Asia and Africa rather than Europe? Because with this idea that they are winning, they are trying to build a coalition with those who are opening the doors for the Russian officials meeting, and in this case demonstrating to others, including Europe, that they are not isolated and that world beyond the first world is with Russia in this Russian-Ukrainian war.
Happymon, I think that's one for you. Great question.
Totally, I agree with you. I think there is a great deal of smart messaging, information, propaganda, call it what you want, that's happening in the global south. But not all of that is without any basis either. In full disclosure, I was in Moscow on October 7th when the sort of terror attack happened. And the Russians were very happy. Well, this is going to flip the war, they said. And much of the global south today is unhappy about what's happening. So there is propaganda, there is information warfare, but there is also a certain set of realities that must be that you must be aware of.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. Isaac Flanagan, Zero Line. Neil, you made a, I think, fairly cogent case for that we should not here in this room or anywhere hang our hat on a imminent economic or industrial collapse of Russia, that's foolhardy. But there are other seams in a nation. Obviously, Russia is quite large. It has a lot more ethnic and cultural diversity than it's given credit for. So, Jade, I would pose the question to you, are there other cracks or seams outside of the industrial and economic domain where we might be able to start to see some fissures appear in the Russian Federation?
Thank you for the question. Yes, certainly, and in some ways they also overlap. Perhaps, for example, if we look at Russia's demographic problems are often widely spoken about, but the difficulty Russia has in getting a workforce to work in its war factories, and then the tensions that includes in terms of migration. Often any discussions of Russia and immigration tend to focus on how Russia is increasing these tensions within other societies or exploiting them. However, Russia has plenty of its own, both sort of homegrown inter-ethnic tensions. So, for example, how much Ingushetians do not always get on with Chechens. We could have the long-term disagreements over certain aspects of history between Bashkirs and Tatars, and of course all of the problems between ethnic Russians, or Slavic Russians, it's a problematic phrase, but and other nationalities. And then what to do about the fact that so many of Russian soldiers have been embedded within a highly ethno-nationalist information space that is very critical of the state propaganda don't get me wrong, it's critical from a pro-war position of wishing that they were able to more effectively kill Ukrainians. It's not against the state propaganda for any sort of, from any high moral grounding. But there are real implicit tensions there that also bring us back to this broader question of, how does Russia stop fighting a war? How does Russia contain its aggression? Because I have no idea how you bring these people back, how you try to reintegrate these levels of veterans, and how Russia is able to continue, actually its relatively high rates of immigration with returning veterans and all of the problems that that represents. So there are many, many points of tension. There are many, many points that could be exploited should one wish to. And ultimately, I would say, of course, it's a rather spicy subject, but I would say that European countries really need to start thinking perhaps about reciprocity within this domain of hybrid warfare.
Minister Kyslytsya, would you like to follow up on that?
I think that it's very important to keep an eye on what's going on in Russia and analyze all the cracks, but we should not put our hopes on Russia collapsing. I think what should be our primary concern is how we make Europe as a whole much stronger than Europe is today. And that's where we have to concentrate our attention. And that is where we have to work with the governments of Europe and to make us stronger militarily and as Europe as a whole.
I think there's a question right over there.
Hello, Sonia Sotus from APCO Global Advisory. Just to build on what you were saying, I think one of the things that we realize is that there is supposed to be a Russian opposition outside of Russia. There are millions of Russians outside of Russia who are not every day hearing the same propaganda. So when we're talking about fissures and when we're talking about should we want to be able to influence change from the outside in as well as from the inside out, I'd like to be able to hear your thoughts on that. I don't hear anything from a Russian opposition. And, you know, as a Ukrainian American, I would find it pretty difficult to believe that Ukrainians would stand for this. They would be protesting morning, noon, and night. So I'd really like to be able to hear your thoughts on that. Where are the Russian immigrants? Where are the democratically minded? Where is the opposition? And how can you use them to change this dynamic?
I think that Andrei Ostovsky might want to say something on that. Do you want to comment on that, Andrei? Because I know you know a lot about the Russian opposition, and probably more than anyone else on this panel, although maybe not.
With a bit of correction, it's Arkady, but that's all right.
Oh, sorry, Arkady, sorry. It's been a long day.
Even though we've worked together. Anyway.
Exactly.
I'm Arkady Ostrovsky. I'm the Russia and Eastern Europe editor of The Economist. I'm not sure how much the Russian opposition outside Russia can do. I mean, they are, you know, the resource which is there and which is working, thanks to European support and thanks to institutions like European Endowment of Democracy, is Russian media, which is incredibly ingenious and does rich and, you know, does broadcast, and YouTube is still operating. So that is a resource. But in terms of opposition inside the country, you know, there can't be an opposition in a concentration camp. It's a dictatorship. It is a tyranny. It's thousands of people in jail who come out. And I think the important line to understand is that these people who are in Russia, Russian society hasn't suddenly changed on the 22nd, on the 24th of February, and the structure hasn't really changed either. And there are voices inside the country. Yes, however many hundred thousands have left Russia, the majority of those people who before that came out on Bolotnaya Square, they're still there. You don't hear their voices because they can't talk freely, because it is a highly repressive regime. And you shouldn't be looking for splits. They're not going to reveal themselves until it's too late. The question that Europe faces and the choices it faces, it can either do what the West did in the Cold War, which is to cultivate and support those people and show some understanding, and then have a constituency when the war is over with which it can talk. Or it can alienate those people who are feeling betrayed because they've been lumbered together with everybody else and the whole of the country supports it. And I think this is a very important policy change, because one will get you a much more isolated and hostile country that resentful, and the
Right.
one will get you the part of the society and constituency which should be at the table.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, Arkady, for getting your name wrong, even though I used to be your boss. Apologies.
I want to conclude with a thought from Minister Kyslytsya, talking about the question at hand here that we look to answer: is Russia winning or collapsing? And I think what you said was very important, that the focus should be on how is Europe strengthening to support Ukraine, rather than focusing on a conceptual idea of a Russian collapse. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I want to thank our panelists for this very important discussion, and of course, yes, for hosting us here in Kyiv, Ukraine. Thank you.